The tray in my hands was shaking, and I could not let anyone see it. Every eye in the grand hall of Callisto Station had turned toward the high table, where the Threnian Empress sat like a blade wrapped in silk. Her name was Cylindria Vey, ruler of 11 star systems, and she had not smiled once in the 7 nights she had been dining at the Ember Garden. I was the waiter assigned to her table, which meant one wrong move could end more than my job. It could end the fragile peace talks happening upstairs, the ones that decided whether Earth stayed free or became another line on a Threnian map. I did not know, that night, that the real danger was not the Empress at all. It was her daughter. Izantre sat at the far end of the table, alone, the way she sat every night. She was young, maybe 19 by human counting, with silver skin and eyes like cut stone that never seemed to blink at the right time. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody dared. She was heir to an empire that could end a city before breakfast, and the guards around her stood so still, they looked like statues carved from fear. I noticed she had not touched her food again. That was the 4th night in a row. I should have kept walking. My manager, a nervous man named Colin, had warned every server on the floor to never speak to the royal family unless spoken to first. But something about the way Isantra stared at her own hands, like they belonged to a stranger, made me stop beside her chair. "You don't like the soup?" I asked quietly. She looked up so fast I thought I had made a mistake I could not undo. "Waiters do not speak," she said, her voice flat, testing the words like they might break. "I just did," I said. Guess I broke a rule. For one long second, I thought a guard would step forward and remove me from the hall. Instead, something flickered behind her eyes. Not a smile, just a crack, thin as glass. "On Threnos," she said, "the heir does not have preferences. Preferences belong to people who are allowed to choose things." I did not have a clever answer for that, so I told her the truth. "That sounds like the loneliest way to eat dinner I have ever heard of." She did not answer, but she did not send me away either. Over the next few nights, small conversations grew between the courses. I learned she liked the slow, quiet music the station band played, while diplomats argued about trade routes upstairs. I learned that on her homeworld, dancing was only allowed in front of a mirror, alone, so no one could see a person feel anything. I told her that on Earth, we danced because we were terrible at silence and worse at hiding our feelings, so we built an excuse to hold on to someone while we figured it out. "That sounds foolish," she said. "It is," I said. "It might be the best thing about being human." I did not know then that someone was already watching us far more closely than I realized. On the 7th night, tension in the hall had grown thick enough to choke on. The trade talks upstairs had stalled. Word had spread through the staff that if an agreement was not reached by midnight, the Threnian fleet stationed beyond the rings would receive new orders, and nobody wanted to guess what those orders might be. The air in the Ember Garden felt tighter than usual, like the whole station was holding its breath. The band began playing something slow, an old human song that sounded like it remembered something it had lost. I do not know what pushed me to do what I did next. Maybe it was the way Isantra looked at her own reflection in the polished table, like a girl trapped inside a statue built by someone else. I set my tray down, which broke at least 6 rules I could name, and held out my hand. "Dance with me." I do not know how. Nobody does, the first time. That is the whole secret of it. I felt the entire hall turn toward us. I felt Colin somewhere behind me go pale enough to match the tablecloth. I felt, more than saw, the exact second Empress Cylindria Vey turned her head away from the trade minister beside her. I felt my future balance on the edge of that silence. Izantre stood anyway. She was stiff at first, counting under her breath, stepping on my boots twice. Then, somewhere in the second turn, she stopped counting. Her shoulders, which had been pulled up toward her ears since the day she arrived, finally came down. She laughed, a small surprise sound, like she had never heard herself make it before, when I spun her, and she nearly knocked over the dessert cart. For 3 full minutes, the heir to an empire of 11 systems was not a treaty asset or a title written into a peace agreement. She was just a girl who had finally been asked to dance instead of told how to rule. When the song ended, the whole hall stayed silent, except for her breathing, quick and bright, and a smile on her face that looked nothing like the portraits hanging in the embassy hallway. I finally made myself look toward the head of the table. The Empress was not calling for guards. She was not rising in anger. She sat completely still, one hand pressed against her chest, and her eyes, the eyes of a woman who had signed treaties and led fleets, and never once, by any account, shown weakness in public, had gone bright with something that looked almost like water. She stood. The entire hall rose with her out of habit and fear. I braced myself for the end of everything. Instead, she crossed the floor slowly, stopped in front of her daughter, and touched her cheek, the way someone touches a memory they are afraid will disappear if they blink. "I forgot," she said, so quietly that only those closest could hear it, "what your mother's laugh sounded like before your father was lost. You carry it. I had forgotten you carried it." Then she turned to me, and for the first time in 7 nights, she looked at me the way a person looks at another person, not the way a ruler looks at furniture. "Waiter, what is your name?" "Eli," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Eli Bennett, Your Grace." "Eli," she said the word slowly, as if testing whether it could carry any weight. "You will teach my daughter this dance properly. Every evening, until we leave this station." It was not a request. Empresses do not make those. But her voice had softened in a way nobody in that hall had heard before, and Asantra was still holding my hand, forgetting, it seemed, to let go. News of what happened traveled fast. By morning, half the station knew that the Threnian Empress had wept in public for the first time in recorded history, and that a human waiter was somehow the reason. Some called it the beginning of trouble, others called it a miracle. I called it terrifying, because I still did not know if I had saved something or broken it. The answer came 2 nights later, during the final negotiation session. I was not allowed inside the meeting room, but Colin told me afterward what he had heard through the door. The Threnian delegation had been prepared to walk away from the table entirely. Their fleet commanders wanted a show of strength instead of a signed agreement. But the Empress had stood, silenced the room, and said something that changed everything. She said that an empire strong enough to conquer stars, but too cold to let its own children laugh, was not strength at all. It was only fear wearing armor. She said she had seen, in a small human gesture on a restaurant floor, more courage than she had witnessed in years of council meetings. Because it takes courage to offer kindness to someone with the power to destroy you. The treaty was signed before midnight. Nobody in that hall knew that history had shifted because of a dance, but I did. I felt it in the way the air changed the next morning, lighter somehow, like the whole station could finally breathe. I kept my promise. Every evening, until the Threnian ships prepared to leave, I taught Isantre new steps, slow ones, fast ones, silly ones that made her laugh so hard she had to stop and catch her breath. She stopped sitting alone at the end of the table. She started sitting closer to her mother, and sometimes, unbelievably, the Empress herself would tap her fingers along to the music, watching her daughter with an expression I can only describe as peace. On the last night before they departed, Solindria Vey approached me at the edge of the hall, away from the guards and the noise. "Is it too late?" she asked, almost shyly, an emotion I never expected to see on the face of a woman who commanded 11 systems, for someone my age to learn. I told her nobody is ever too old for the best part of being human. She let me teach her the first step. It was clumsy and slow, and her guards looked as though they did not know whether to laugh or panic, but for one quiet moment, an Empress and a waiter moved together across a restaurant floor, and no rank or empire or fear stood between them. The next morning, their ships left orbit, and the peace between our worlds held, not because of armies or treaties written in careful legal language, but because a lonely girl had been asked to dance, and her mother had finally remembered what it meant to feel something soft in a life built entirely from steel. I still work the floor at the Ember Garden. I still pour tea for diplomats who could end my world with a single order. But now, sometimes, a small ship arrives from beyond the rings, carrying a young woman, eager to learn a new step, and a message from her mother, thanking a simple waiter for reminding an empire that even the coldest heart is never truly frozen. It is only waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to ask it to dance.